All right, as usual, the muscle unit always, or any unit always has some common prefixes, suffixes, root words you may see in this PowerPoint. There are 3 different prefixes that all mean muscle. So anytime you see my, mys, or sarco, somewhere in a word it means muscle something or other. And then it usually likes to get, stuck to something else when we're talking about muscles. So you'll see those prefixes a lot in this PowerPoint. This initial PowerPoint is mostly just going over, at least today's, a lot of different structures, what we see in a muscle, how it's arranged. So muscle tissue in itself makes up nearly half of your body's mass. So we have a lot of muscle. We've got skeletal muscle, we have cardiac muscle, we have smooth muscle. That's a lot of muscle in our body. Now, muscle can transform chemical energy, ATP, and this is energy found in bonds, like in that last phosphate and the triphosphate, and we can direct it into mechanical energy. This means we are moving things, we are doing something, so we can take the energy that's in ATP, now we can actually do something. So that's it exerts force, and we'll talk about force and all that stuff later. I already said, you're going to see lots of those common prefixes for muscles. Now, types of skeletal muscle. Again, there are 3 types. Types of muscle. 3 types. Skeletal muscle, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal muscle, this is muscle that is attached to bones. And some of it can be attached to skin, but at some point, yes, it's going to be attached to bones. Hence the skeletal muscle. The cells that we find in skeletal muscle, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about skeletal muscle, but the cells are really, really long enough that we actually call the cells muscle fibers. So a muscle fiber is just a really long muscle cell. They are striated, meaning they have stripes to them. They're voluntary, which means we can control our skeletal muscle. They can contract rapidly, which means we can move them very, very quick. However, they can tire easily, so when you start doing the same thing over and over again, you get tired. And they can be very, very powerful, that yes, we can contract all of our muscles and lift a car and all that stuff. They do require nervous system stimulation. Our brain has to tell our muscles to do something, or at least the spinal cord. They are not going to contract on their own, as in some of the other muscles. Something has to tell the muscle to contract. Also, because they were really, really long, and they also have lots of nuclei. Instead of just like one nucleus right in the middle of a cell, as most of the cells we've looked at, we had a whole lab on it. You should just have one nucleus. Skeletal muscles are so long, they have lots of nuclei, and they hang around along the edges instead of in the middle. Cardiac muscle, only place we find it in the entire body. Our heart, that's it. That's the majority of our heart walls. It's also striated, so it also has stripes to it. It can contract without nervous system stimulation. So the brain doesn't have to tell it to contract. There are cells in there that naturally will contract. And this is why if you've ever dissected anything like a cold-blooded animal, like a frog or a fish, you can actually remove a heart, put it in a petri dish, and it will just beat away for a while. It's cool. And they can do this. I was going to say, your heart itself will do this too. When they do heart transplants, it will beat, not for a long time, but for a little bit. It can contract without nervous system stimulation. It's involuntary, which means you can't control it. You can't just be like, okay, I wish you would start beating faster, or I wish you would slow down. And you can't control your heart beating. The cells either have one nucleus or 2 nuclei, so they're uninucleate or binucleate. And they contain intercalated discs, and which we'll get more into when we get into the heart itself. It's just between every single cell, there's a disc that connects the cells together. It allows it so all the heart can work together. So the discs are just in between each cell. Smooth muscle, we find it in walls of hollow organs. So these are like tube-like organs. And so something goes through, because they're never actually hollow, but something goes through it. Our stomach, stuff's going through it all the time. Our bladder, things are going through it. Various airways, things are going through it. The main job, since they make up the walls of these hollow organs where things go through, when they contract, they move when that smooth muscle contracts, it moves that whatever it is that's in it through. And we find it in the blood vessel, and our blood vessel walls have smooth muscles. When it contracts, it moves blood through. I'm like, when it's in the bladder or in the ureters, and I'm like, when that contracts, it moves urine through. And so I'm like, it's just constantly moving whatever's inside of it through. They are non-striated, which means they don't have any stripes. That's why they get their name smooth, non-striped. They can also contract without nervous system stimulation, so we don't need our brain telling it to do it, and I'm like, it can contract. It's also involuntary. We have no control over it. And the cells found here only just have one single nucleus. So this is just showing some of the different pictures. Here's your skeletal muscle. It has the striations, lots of nuclei that hang around the edge of the cell. Again, these cells are really long, so this is like 3.5, 4 kind of total cells here, but they keep going in either direction. I've just sliced them. And I'm like, our cardiac muscle also has stripes. I'm like, it has 1, maybe 2 nuclei. Between each cell, it has these dark staining discs. Those are the intercalated discs. Smooth muscle, I always think they just look like a football, and we stretched a little bit thinner. That's how they're shaped. They stack up. They usually just have 1 nuclei right in the middle of it. This is kind of just showing some of the differences between them. In your book, it's all table 9.3. What do they control? How do they contract? The interesting part, both the smooth muscle and the skeletal muscle, they contract aerobically, which means they need what? They need oxygen to contract. However, your skeletal muscle could do both. Your skeletal muscle could contract with oxygen. It can also contract if you don't have enough oxygen. That's when you get sore. But I'm like, but it can contract without oxygen as well. Now, some special characteristics of muscle tissue. 4 interesting little terms that our muscle can do. 1, it's excitable, which means it can respond to information or respond to stimuli. So it's just kind of waiting for something to tell it to do. That's the excitable part. What do you think is going to tell it to do? Which system is going to tell the muscle to do something? The brain, the nervous system, which we just got done talking about. And so I'm like, it's going to receive information, it's going to respond to some type of stimuli, and it's going to do something. It's contractible, which means it can shorten and generate force when it shortens. No other muscle or no other type of tissue can do that. No other tissue can shorten and generate force. That's only something muscle tissue can do. It's extensible, which means we can stretch it beyond its normal resting length. And I'm like, I can stretch muscle. Sometimes that feels good when you're like, oh, I just want to stretch it beyond its normal resting length. Other tissue can't always do that. It would tear right away. And our muscle is elastic, which means if you stretch it beyond its normal resting length, it will go right back to its normal resting length, kind of like a rubber band. It recoils back to its normal resting length. So we can stretch our muscle, and it will recoil. We can also contract it and shorten it and generate force. Unique things that muscle tissue can do. Now, muscle functions. Some of important functions. 1, it moves things. It moves bones if it's skeletal muscle. It moves fluid. It can move blood. And I'm like, it can move anything through our entire body. So it does a lot of movement. It can maintain our posture and body position. And like the fact we've got muscles all holding us up right now, so you're not falling over, helps you maintain posture and body position. It can help stabilize joints. We've got muscles all over our joints, and I'm like, that are controlling it so they don't go too far. But I'm like, they keep it nice and hopefully in place. And they can also generate heat, especially your skeletal muscle. This is why I'm like, after you start working out or you start making those skeletal muscles start working, you get hot and you start to get sweaty because you're overheating. Some other additional functions. 1, they can help protect organs. You've probably all had someone be like, yeah, come on, just hit me right here in the stomach. And I'm like, well, you can contract all your muscles and they become really hard and you can hit someone not too hard. In the stomach, they protect internal organs. They form valves, and I'm like, in our heart, in our blood vessels. And I'm like, that's all different types of muscle tissue. They can control your pupil size. There are muscles there that whether they contract or dilate, they can cause goosebumps. That's that erector pillae muscle that we find in our skin. So they've got all these other additional little functions too. Now, we're going to focus a ton of time on skeletal muscle. A little bit on cardiac and smooth, but some of that we talk about when we get into certain other systems anyways. Now, your skeletal muscle, there's 3 connective tissue sheaths that cover your skeletal muscle. All of our skeletal muscle includes these sheaths and it includes the cells. But we have an epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. Why do these sound kind of familiar? In the nerves, we had what? The epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium. And I'm like, your skeletal muscle and your nerves are arranged very similarly, which works out really well. And I'm like, so the entire outside of a muscle, just like the entire outside of a nerve, was, nerve was epineurium. On a muscle, it's epimysium. Again, MYS means muscle. So on the whole outside of the muscle, you have epimysium. Now, there are also bundles, except they're a little more oval instead of round. Each bundle is called a fascicle, just like in a nerve. It is covered by your perineurium. I've got it on here. The perineurium covers each fascicle. Now, inside fascicles, we have muscle fibers, aka muscle cells. And surrounding each one of the muscle fibers is your endoneurium. Here's muscle cell. I'm like, so all the tissue that surrounds the muscle fibers or muscle cells is your endoneurium, arranged just like your nerves. It works great. Instead of neuro for the nerve system, we have got the mice, and I'm like, or the mice, and I'm like, for muscles. Now, for attaching, when you have skeletal muscle, it has to attach in two places, usually to two different bones. We always have an origin and we have an insertion for the two different places it attaches. The insertion is your more movable bone. Like if I'm moving something, if I've got two bones that's attaching to it, and I'm like, the bone that is more movable, I would consider that my insertion. The bone that is least or less movable, I consider that the origin, where the muscle originated. Now, muscle can be attached directly to the bone. So it's either a direct attachment or indirect. So the muscle may be attached. The epimysium, this outside covering, will be attached directly to the bone, to the periosteum. If you're like, oh, these terms are all coming back. The periosteum, it's that outside membrane that covers the outside of bone. So that means muscle attached directly to bone, or it could be attached directly to cartilage. But that's a direct attachment. The muscle is attached directly to bone. I've got a picture. And I'm like, indirect. Before the muscle connects to the bone, it forms, a lot of times it's that epineurium, it forms a tendon or a sheet-like aponeurosis. I'm like, so it's all the epimysium forms this big long tendon or this flat sheet-like thing called an aponeurosis. And then the muscle attaches to bone or to something else. Now, an example. Muscle is attached directly to bone right here. This is a direct attachment, muscle to bone. At the other end of this muscle, it forms a tendon. All the epimysium that was on the outside of this muscle right here gathers together. So this is just all epimysium. It forms a tendon, and then this tendon attaches to the bone. This would be an indirect attachment. So the muscle tissue itself is not attached directly to bone. It first forms a tendon. Now, when I talk about an aponeurosis, because we'll look at some of these in lab on Tuesday, a sheet-like tendon, instead of having this, kind of round rope-like tendon, occasionally you can have lots and lots of muscle all having this tissue at the end, and it forms this big flat sheet. We call it an aponeurosis. And I'm like, we have a big one right over our abdomen. Now, looking at the outside of a muscle and get it all the way in. So, muscle with your epimysium, you have your fascicles, and I'm like, we're going to zoom in on the fascicle. There we go. Here's my fascicle. Now, inside the fascicle, there's perimysium around it, we find muscle fibers, again, which is the fancy way of seeing a really long muscle cell. So there's our muscle fiber. We're going to zoom in on the muscle fiber. There's our muscle fiber. Muscle fiber. There you are. Here's my muscle fiber, which is covered in endomysium. And inside a muscle fiber, inside of a cell, we find a whole bunch of other little rod-like structures called myofibrils. They're like fibers made of muscle, inside of a muscle fiber. So myofibrils are inside of muscle fibers. They almost sound like the exact same thing, and they're not. So myofibrils are inside of muscle fibers. Now, my little note, because I'm like, if you're like, how am I going to remember this? If it helps to remember, and I'm like, so this is the number of muscle fibers, this is your cells. Your number of muscle cells in your body does not change. It doesn't change. You have the same number of muscle cells now as when you did when you were a kid. If I started weightlifting, my muscle cells, my muscle fibers, the number will not change. And some of you are like, but they get bigger. They can, yes. If you work out enough, this muscle fiber, it is still one muscle fiber. However, if I start lifting weights, here's my one muscle fiber, that number doesn't change. But the number of myofibrils inside can change. So the number of cells can't change, but these little tiny myofibrils, these other tiny little rods on the inside, they can change. You can get more of those. So if you start working out, you're going to get more myofibrils, these other tiny little rods found in there. So your muscle fibers get big, your cells get bigger, you just don't get more cells. Your cells get bigger. So these tiny little myofibrils that you can get more of if you work out, that we find inside of a cell, we're going to zoom in on that. Now, as we start looking in, can you see the striations? Like it looks striped. There's a reason for the striped. If I zoom in on this tiny little myofibril, I have these dark bands, and I have these light bands. Now, anywhere we have, I'm like, these a little bit of light, half of this light area, half of this light area, and this dark area in the middle, this little section is called a sarcomere. And we've got this sarcomere, and then there's another sarcomere, and then there's another one, and they keep going along. I'm going to zoom in on that. There we go. Here's my sarcomere. It's like half of my light section, half of my light section, dark area. So half of this light, dark. This is a sarcomere. We'll talk a little bit more about what's all in it in a second. And I'm like, but in this dark areas, light areas, in these repeating segments inside of these, we have myofilaments. Again, anything myo means muscles, so these filaments. And there are two different ones, thick ones and thin ones. Thick, thin. We'll get into the thick and thin, I think, today. So, some basics of a skeletal muscle fiber. Muscle fibers, again, are muscle cells. They are really long cylindrical cells. They're somewhere between 10 and 100 micrometers in diameter. They're not very wide. However, they can be up to 30 centimeters long. They can be really long. A muscle fiber runs the entire, one muscle cell, one muscle fiber runs the entire length of the muscle. Some of the longest muscles we have, and I'm like, are in our thigh, which means every muscle running from, our quadricep muscles, we'll get later into naming, but I'm like, the long muscles that run along your thigh, each cell is that length. So when you think about the cells we've looked at in lab, these are these microscopic, tiny, like round things. Instead, now we have a cell that is 30 centimeters long. That's a really long cell. They're skinny, but they're really long. And because they are so long and they have to do so much, they have lots and lots of nuclei. We don't want one nuclei on the 30 centimeter long muscle trying to figure out what's going on. So we've got lots of them along the entire muscle. And they all like to hang out on the edges. That's the peripheral part. Now we like to name things, and I'm like, to make them better at naming. Anything that, or I was going to say, the word lemma means a membrane. I don't remember if I had that on my first slide or not. I'm going to, just because I want to look. Ooh. Yep, there we go. Now, sarco means what? It means muscle. It's one of the three things that means muscle. So a sarcolemma is a muscle membrane. Instead of saying, oh, the outside part of a cell, when normally it's the plasma membrane, it's that phospholipid bilayer, it still is, but we give it a fancy name, and we call it the sarcolemma. So instead of saying the plasma membrane on the outside of a muscle cell, sarcolemma, I can just shorten it. It just means the plasma membrane found on the muscle cell. Same thing. Instead of just saying the cytoplasm found in a muscle cell, I just call it a sarcoplasm. It's just a muscle plasm, like just taking off cyto and being more specific. This is the cytoplasm found in a muscle cell. Now, some unique structures, since we're talking about cells. It still has mitochondria, it still has nuclei, it still has, some of the other, normal cell functions, but it's got a couple other modified structures. It has myofibrils, these big, long, skinny things in there. It has a sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it has T-tubules that we find in these cells. Now, myofibrils, these are the things, like they're densely packed rod-like elements that make up the majority of the cell. Myofibrils can change in number if you work out. And I'm like, so these are all these little rod things that make up the majority of the cell. It's on here we find those sarcomeres, those repeating units of light bands and dark bands. I was going to say, they show us the striations. Again, I was going to say we have dark, it's kind of my pink, and I'm like dark A bands and light I bands. And we're going to zoom in on the sarcomere right here. Here's one sarcomere. Here's a light band, dark band, light band. And there's different regions in here that gives us all of these striations, the stripes inside of our muscle. One, we have what's known as the H zone. So one sarcomere, here's my sarcomere. It runs from a Z disc to a Z disc. Some books call them Z lines, Z something. And I'm like, which I always think I'm like, Z is the last letter of the alphabet. It's the ends of the sarcomeres. So Z disc to Z disc is one sarcomere. Now, in the middle, right in the middle of my dark area, I have what's called the H zone. And I'm like, I have it, the filaments don't overlap here. And when I'm talking between my blue, my light blue, and my darker red, they don't overlap. All there is some dark red there. The Z disc or the Z line, these are a bunch of proteins found at the end of the sarcomeres, where the things are attaching to. The thick filaments, and I'm like, are my dark bands. They run the entire length of your A. So I go red to red, it's an A band. And I bands are just where you find thin filaments and just the blue lines only. Now, we're going to look to see what actually are these dark bands, thick filaments and thin filaments. They are named, and I'm like, for the proteins they find in them. I was going to say, I'm like, some more stuff I've already talked about. Here we go. Zoom in. I was going to say another picture. And I'm like, here's my thick filaments. Now, my thick filaments, I know it's on one of my next slides, but I'm writing anyways, are composed of a protein called myosin. The big, thick, pink ones. The thin filaments, my blue ones, are composed of a protein called actin. Now, if you're like, how am I going to remember which one's the thick one, which one's the thin one? Which word has more letters? Myosin, only by one. But it's enough. It's the bigger word. It's the thicker filament. Like one extra letter, fine. It's the thick filament. Now, 'cause I'm hoping I can get through what they look like. Myosin, my thick protein. One, and I'm like, it has this cool double structured, and I'm like, twisted, I was going to say, two interwoven. They're twisted chains that end in the heads. So, two twisted chains end in two little heads at the end. I can't draw all that well, so there's the two heads and twisted chains. They're twisting on each other. Now, I could care less about the tail. I care about the head. We call it the business end of the myosin because it's where things happen. Reason why, it has two binding sites. ATP will bind there, so now it will be energized, and it will bind to actin there as well, because it wants to bind to the thin filament. So all the stuff happens in the head area. The thin, I got one more slide. The thin filament, also a double twisted strand. I always think they look like tiny little blueberry chains, and I'm like, that just twisted around. And I'm like, this is the thin filament. It's made of actin. That's all of the blueberry things. It has little darker spots on it. Those darker spots are active sites. So each one of these are active sites. However, are they exposed? Can you see all of the active sites? No, they're covered. And I'm like, there are two other proteins on your actin. Tropomyosin and troponin, they both kind of sound alike. And I'm like, tropomyosin, the bigger word, and I'm like, covers all of the active sites when the muscle is at rest. And it's an active site, which means nothing can happen if it's covered. Troponin, this little yellow protein, just anchors. It just holds the tropomyosin in place. Like, I'm holding you, I'm anchoring that tropomyosin, and it's going to cover all the active sites. And so nothing could happen until our nervous system tells it to do something. We'll pick up there next time.